When Sarah Wren buried her husband in the spring of 1884, Caleb Wren left her a single page of notes, a half-dug trench behind the north wall of the ranch house, and the instruction that it must be finished before the first hard frost. He had not said why. He had not lived long enough to say why. The fever had taken him inside of 9 days, and the last thing he had done, before his hands could no longer hold the pencil, was fold that page in half and press it into her palm as if it were a coin she might spend later. At some store neither of them had yet seen, Sarah was 31 years old that spring. The ranch lay 6 miles east of a settlement called Kettle Bend in the eastern shadow of the Bighorns in the Wyoming Territory. It ran to a little over 300 acres of thin grass and stubborn stone, and it had been her husband's father's before him, and his grandfather's before that, and every man in that line had died younger than he ought to have. She had come to understand the ranch as a place that ate its keepers slowly. She did not intend to be eaten. She read the page 100 times in the weeks after the burying. It was written in the careful pencil of a man who had learned to write late. The lines slanted upward toward the right, as if the words themselves were climbing out of the paper. The first 2 pages, if there had ever been 2 pages, were gone. What remained began mid-thought, and it read like this: measure from the wellhead north-northeast, 42 paces to the ridge stone, and dig the trench 3 feet deep, no less, and lay the stone as you have seen me lay it. Do not fill the trench with earth. Fill it with something else. And when the north wall is finished, do not, under any circumstances, leave the north wall without. There the page ended. There was nothing after. The rest had been torn away, or lost, or never written. Sarah folded the page and put it in the tin box that held her marriage lines and her mother rings and the deed to the land, and she walked out behind the north wall of the cabin to look at what her husband had left. The trench was there, in the shape of a long, shallow bracket wrapped around the north side of the house. It was 3 feet deep in places and less than a foot deep in others. He had gotten perhaps a third of it done before the fever set in. She stood at the edge of it and considered the ridge stone, 42 paces away, and the wellhead, and the small pile of flat river rocks he had been hauling from the creek all winter, for reasons no one, including herself, had understood. A drifter came down the wagon road on the morning of the second Tuesday in October. She saw him from the porch. He was afoot, which was unusual in that country, and he was leading a mule that carried nothing but a bedroll and a buck saw and a shovel with a chipped blade. He was tall and lean and weathered the color of harness leather, and he had the kind of walk that meant he had been walking a long time and had not decided yet where he was going to stop. She watched him come up the road, and she did not go inside. He stopped at the edge of the yard and took his hat off. She could not tell his age. He might have been 35. He might have been 50. His eyes were the color of creek water in November. He said, "Mom, I was told down in Kettle Bend that you might have work." She said, "I might." He said, "I can mend fences. I can pull stumps. I can lay stone. I don't drink, and I don't sit down until the work is done." She said, "What's your name?" He said. They call me Ash." He did not offer a last name, and she did not ask for one. She said, "I can pay you in meals and a bed in the barn, and $1 a week come spring if the work holds." He said, "Stay till spring. I'll mend every fence." He said it the way another man might say good morning. There was no promise in it, and yet it was a promise. She understood, standing there with the October wind pushing at her skirts and the smell of wood smoke coming off the chimney and the mule stamping at a fly, that a thing had just been agreed to that neither of them could yet name. She showed him the barn, and she showed him the well, and she showed him the smokehouse. She did not show him the trench. She did not know why she did not show him the trench. Perhaps because it was the last thing her husband had touched, and to show it to a stranger felt like handing over a letter she had not yet finished reading. He asked her, that first evening at the supper table, what her husband had been working on before he died. She said a great many things. He nodded and did not press. He nodded and did not press. He ate his cornbread slowly and thanked her for the meal and went out to the barn without another word. The first 2 mockers came on a Friday, near the end of October. They were brothers named Toller, and they ran cattle on the section south of hers. They came riding up the road on a pretense of borrowing a length of chain, and they saw the drifter at the far end of the west pasture, setting a fence post. and they came into the yard, grinning as if they had caught her at something. Elmer Toller was the older brother, and the one who had known her husband since boyhood. He was a big man with a small mouth, and he leaned down from his saddle and said, "So you took in a stray, Sarah." She said, "I hired a hand." He said Caleb would laugh himself sick. Caleb never trusted a man who walked. She said Caleb trusted plenty of men who walked. Elmer said, Caleb wasn't right about much toward the end, was he? He said it easily, as if he were commenting on the weather, and it landed in her like a splinter under the nail. She did not answer. She handed him the chain. He took it and did not thank her, and rode off with his brother. And she heard them laughing before they were out of the yard. The second mocker was the widow Halberd, who had been Caleb's mother's closest friend, and who now considered herself the executor of Caleb's memory. She came in her buggy on a Sunday afternoon with a covered dish of stewed apples and a face full of concern. She sat at Sarah's kitchen table, and she said, "Sarah, dear, that trench behind the house." She said that the trench is a scar on the ground. She said Caleb had a great many notions in his last months, and not all of them were sound, and you must not feel obliged to finish what a sick man started. Sarah poured her another cup of coffee and did not speak. The widow Halberd said, "Fill it in, Sarah. Fill it in and let the man rest." Sarah said, "I'll consider it." The widow Halberd left the stewed apples on the table and drove away, and Sarah sat for a long time with her hand on the tin box in the top drawer of the sideboard. The third mocker was the one who cut deepest, and he did not mean to. His name was Harlan Peake, and he was the mill owner in Kettlebondwood, and he had known Caleb Wren better than any man alive. He came out to the ranch in the first week of November because he had heard Sarah had hired a drifter, and he wanted to see her situation for himself. He was a decent man. He had loaned Caleb money once without interest, and he had refused to be paid back. He sat on her porch with his hat in his hands, and he said, "Sarah, I don't know what Caleb was digging back there," I asked him. He wouldn't say. He said, "Caleb was my friend for 30 years, and I loved him, and I am telling you as one who loved him. He was not himself at the end. I have seen it before in men who work too hard and think too much. The trench is nothing. Let it go. Turn the ground over and plant it in barley in the spring." Harlan Peake said all of this with such gentleness that Sarah could not find a place in it to be angry. She only nodded. She thanked him for coming. She watched him drive away, and she stood on the porch. A long time after his dust had settled, she did not defend her husband to any of them. She simply continued. That night, she took the tin box out of the sideboard, and she carried it to the barn, and she sat down on an overturned crate across from Ash, who was oiling a length of bridle by lantern light, and she opened the box and took out the folded page and laid it on the crate between them. She said, "My husband was digging a trench behind the north wall of this house when he died. He left me this page of notes. I don't know what he was building. I know he meant for it to be finished before the first hard frost, and I know the frost will come inside in 3 weeks. I have been told by 3 people. I respect that the trench is nothing, and I should fill it in." Ash did not touch the page. He looked at it in the lamplight for a long moment, and then he looked at her. He said, "Are you asking me if you should fill it in?" She said, "No. I am telling you that we are going to finish it. I want to know if you will help me." He said, "Yes, Mom." He said, "May I read it?" She slid the page across the crate. He read it slowly, moving his lips over the words the way a man who has taught himself to read out of necessity rather than schooling. He read it 3 times. Then he folded it and slid it back to her. He said, "Your husband knew something." She said, "How do you know?" He said, 42 paces from the wellhead to the ridge stone is not a random measurement. That is a line laid on a slope. That is a man who is reading the ground." He said, and the phrase "lay the stone" as "you have seen me lay," it means he was teaching someone. "Was he teaching you?" She said, "No." He said, "Well, he was teaching somebody. Or he was writing to a version of himself he trusted more than the one that was dying." Sarah did not sleep that night. She lay in the bed she had shared with Caleb. And she thought about a man teaching a version of himself he trusted more than the one that was dying, and she found that she could believe such a thing. They began on a Wednesday. The morning came in cold and gray, with a smell of iron in the air that meant snow was somewhere behind the ridge, waiting. Ash paced off the distance from the wellhead to the ridge stone. He walked it 3 times. He said, 42 paces even, on a bearing of about 20 degrees east of north. He said, "This is a groundwater line." She said, "How do you know?" He said, "I don't yet." He began at the shallow end of the trench, where Caleb had left off, and he cut down through the sod with a chipped blade shovel. Sarah worked beside him with a second shovel. They did not speak much. The soil was heavy black loam for the first foot, and then it turned to a pale clay, and then to a coarse gravel that clicked against the blade like teeth. Ash stopped when he reached the gravel. He knelt down and picked up a handful of it and let it run through his fingers. He said, "Look here." She looked. He said, "This gravel is wet, and it is wet in November, in a dry year, 6 feet uphill of the well." He said, "Your husband was digging a French drain, but he was digging it in the wrong direction." She said, "What do you mean?" He said, "A French drain moves water away from a foundation. This trench is moving water toward the house." She looked at him and she said, "Then he was digging something else." Ash said yes, he was. That evening, Ash sat on the porch step with a scrap of paper and a stub of pencil, and he drew a shape in the dirt with the pencil first, and then copied it onto the paper. It was a long, shallow bracket wrapped around the north wall of the house, with a lip at the uphill end and a channel running down toward the wall. He said, "I have seen this once before. A Norwegian stonemasons in the Dakotas built a thing like this behind a settler's soddy. He called it something I could not pronounce. It was a heat trench. It caught the winter sun on the stone during the short days, and it released the heat back against the north wall through the coldest hours of the night." He said the stone had to be a certain kind, a dark stone, and it had to be laid a certain way, tilted just so, and packed with something between the stones that would hold the warmth. He said the settler survived a winter that killed every other family in the valley. Sarah said, "What was packed between the stones?" Ash said, "I don't remember." He said, "But your husband will have known." She said, "That is not written on the page." He said, "No." He said it was written on the page that is missing. That was the first cliffhanger, though neither of them called it that. There was a gap. There was a gap in the notes, and it sat between them all through supper, and it was there in the morning when they went back to the trench. They worked through the second week of November laying stone. Ash showed Sarah how to lift the flat river rocks Caleb had hauled from the creek, and how to set them at a slight angle against the trench wall, tilted upward toward the low winter sun. He showed her how to shim them with smaller stones. He showed her how to read a stone with her hand, how to feel for the flat face, how to feel for the grain, how to know which face wanted to lie down and which face wanted to stand. She had not known a stone had a preference. She learned that it did. The taller brothers came by again in the second week. They stood at the fence line, and they watched Ash and Sarah setting stone in a trench, and Elmer Taller called out, "You, laying tile down there. Sarah, you are fixing to drain the whole county." His brother laughed. Ash did not look up. Sarah did not look up. They kept setting stones. The Tollers rode off after a while. The widow Halberd came by on a Sunday, and she saw the stone in the trench, and she pressed her lips together, and she left without coming inside. Sarah watched her go. Harlan Peake came by in the third week, and he stood at the edge of the trench, and he looked at the stone, and he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Sarah, I do not know what you are building." He said, "I hope to God you know." Sarah said, "I know enough." Harlan Peake nodded, and he did not smile, and he drove away, and she understood that of the three of them, he was the only one whose disappointment cost her something, because he had loved Caleb, and she had wanted him to see what Caleb had seen. She did not tell Ash about any of this. Ash worked. She worked beside him. The trench filled with stone in a long, slow spiral around the north wall of the house. There came a morning near the end of November when Ash straightened up from the trench and put his hand flat against the north wall of the house and stood there a long moment. Sarah asked him what he was doing. He said, "I am listening." She said, "To what?" He said, "To the wall." He said, "This wall is cold on the outside, and it is cold on the inside. It has no ear for the sun." He said, "We can lay every stone in this county in that trench, and it will do us no good if this wall will not hear it." That night, Ash went out to the barn, and he came back with a bundle of cloth wrapped around something heavy. He unwrapped it on the kitchen table. It was a book. It was bound in a black leather that had been worn to gray at the corners, and it had been rebound once with sinew, and it smelled of pipe tobacco and old smoke. He said, "This belonged to a man I knew in the Black Hills." He said, "I have not opened it in 6 years." He said, I think there is a page in it about the north wall. Sarah watched him turn the pages. His hands were steady. He found the page. He read it silently. He read it again. Then he read it aloud to her. The passage said that a north wall in a cold country must be given a second skin, a layer of dead air, held between the outer wall and an inner sheathing, and packed with a dry material that would not settle and would not rot. It listed the materials in order of quality. The first was wool. The second was hair. The third, and the one most often used because it was cheapest and most available, was dry chaff mixed with wood ash in equal parts, packed by hand between the studs of an inner wall. Ash closed the book. He looked at Sarah. He said, "I believe this is what was on the missing page." He said, "I cannot prove it." "But I believe it," Sarah said. "We have chaff." She said, "We have 3 barrels of it in the loft of the barn." She said, "We have ash. We have 4 winters' worth in the ash pit behind the smokehouse." Ash said, "Mom," he said, "we are going to build an inner wall." They began on the first day of December. The frost had come in the last week of November, mild at first, then hard on the last night of the month, hard enough that the pump handle at the well was welded shut in the morning, and Sarah had to pour a kettle of boiling water down its throat to loosen it. Ash pulled the good pine boards out of the barn loft, boards Caleb had milled 2 summers back and never used, and he began framing an inner wall 6 inches inside the north wall of the house. He set the studs. He plated them top and bottom. He left a gap of clear space, 6 inches wide, running the full length of the north wall, from floor joist to ceiling beam. Then they packed it. Sarah brought the chaff from the barn a bucket at a time, and Ash brought the ash from the pit, and they mixed it on the kitchen floor in equal parts, and they packed it into the gap between the walls by hand. It was slow work. It took them 9 days. Sarah's hands cracked at the knuckles and bled, and she wrapped them in linen and kept packing. Ash worked in silence. The ash powdered his face and his beard until he looked like a man coming back from a fire. Neither of them said a word about how strange this was, how strange it would look to any passerby, how strange it already looked to the widow Halberd, who came by on the 5th day and stood in the kitchen and said, "Sarah, in the name of heaven, what are you doing?" Sarah said, "Packing a wall." The widow Halberd said, "With ashes." Sarah said, "With ashes and chaff." The widow Halberd left and did not come back that winter. They finished the inner wall on the 10th of December. Ash sheathed it over with the last of the good pine boards. He nailed it neat and tight. When he was done, the north side of the kitchen looked no different than before, except that the room was 6 inches smaller, and the wall, when Sarah put her hand to it, was warm. She stood there a long time with her palm flat against the pine. The storm came on the 16th of December. It came the way the bad ones always came in that country. Not with wind at first, but with a stillness. The air went dead. The birds went quiet. The smoke from the chimney climbed straight up as if it were being drawn by a string. Ash came in from the barn at midday, and he said, "Mom, it's coming." She said, "How long?" He said, "Before dark." He was right by an hour. The snow began at 4 in the afternoon. By 6, it was blowing sideways. By 8, the wind was howling out of the north, like something in pain, and the temperature had fallen so far that the nails in the walls were popping like small pistol shots as the iron contracted. Sarah lit the stove, and Ash brought in wood, 3 armloads, 4, 5, until the wood box was heaped over. The mule and the 2 cows were in the barn with the door barred, and a lantern hung low. The chickens were in a crate in the kitchen, because Ash had said, "You don't leave chickens in a barn on a night like this." The storm settled in for its long work. The first night, Sarah slept in her own bed, and Ash slept on a pallet in the kitchen near the stove, and the wind had always come at the north wall, and Sarah lay in the dark and listened to it. And for the first time in her marriage to that house, she did not feel the cold coming through. The second day, the storm did not let up. Ash went out to the barn on a line he had strung between the porch post and the barn door, a piece of rope he had thought to put up in November, when the sky was clear, because he was a man who thought about the second day of storms, while other men were still enjoying the first day of sun. He came back with milk and eggs, and a report that the animals were warm. He did not say the trench was working. He did not need to. Sarah made bread. She made soup. She banked the fire. She sat by the window and watched the snow build against the south side of the house until it covered the lower sash, and she thought about her husband, and she thought about the missing page. The third night was when the doubt came. It came the way doubt always came to her. Not in the day, when there was work to do, but in the hour after supper, when the dishes were washed and the fire was low and there was nothing left to do but sit with her own mind. She sat at the kitchen table, and she looked at the folded page of Caleb's notes, and she read the broken line again. Do not under any circumstances leave the north wall without. Without what? Without what? She had done what she understood the notes to say. She had built what she thought her husband had wanted her to build. She hoped it was what he had meant. She had no way to ask. She did not weep. She had done her weeping the year before. She only sat. Ash came in from checking the barn, and he saw her at the table with the page open in front of her. And he stopped at the door with the snow stills on his coat, and he understood, in the way that some men understand things without being told, what she was thinking. He did not sit. He did not touch her. He said, Mom. He said, you built what he showed you how to build. He said, that is all a man can ask of anyone. He said, my father used to say a thing to me when I was young, and I did not understand it then, and I understand it now. He said, when a man leaves you an instruction you cannot finish, you finish the part you can, and you trust him for the part you cannot. He said, that is what faith is on the frontier. It is not the church kind of faith. It is the kind of faith that a man has in another man's work. Sarah nodded. She did not speak. Ash went out to the barn again to check the line. She sat at the table until the fire burned down to coals, and then she banked it and went to bed, and she slept, and she dreamed of nothing. The storm broke on the morning of the fourth day. The sun came up over country that had been erased and rewritten in white. The snow was 4 feet deep in the yard and 8 feet where it had drifted against the south wall. Ash dug them out. It took him half a day to clear a path to the barn. The first knock came that afternoon. It was Harlan Peak. He had ridden out from Kettle Bend on a horse that was staggering by the time he reached the yard. He came into the kitchen, and he stood by the stove, and he could not speak for a long moment because his face was too cold to move. When he could speak, he said, Sarah. He said the toller's place burned in the night. The stovepipe went, and the wall caught, and they got out, but they got out with nothing. He said, they are at my house. My house is full. There are 11 people at my house, and I have wood for 4 days. Sarah said, how many can I take? Harlan Peak said, 4 would ease me. She said, send 6. Send the tollers, and send whoever else is worse off. I have room. I have wood. I have a wall that holds heat. Harlan Peak looked at her for a long moment. He said, Sarah. He said, I owe your husband an apology I cannot make. She said, then don't make it to me. She said, make it to the ground he's buried in, when the snow melts, and go on. Harlan Peak rode back to Kettle Bend. He came back the next day with 6 people in a sledge. 4 of them were the tollers, Elmer and his brother, and Elmer's wife and their small son. The other 2 were an old couple from the east end of the settlement whose roof had gone under the snow. Sarah took them in. She put the old couple in her bedroom. She put the taller wife and the boy in the loft. She put Elmer and his brother on pallets by the stove. Elmer Toller did not look at her the first evening. He sat by the stove, and he held his son, and he stared into the fire. Late in the night, when the others were sleeping and Sarah was banking the coals, he spoke to her. He said, Sarah. He said, I said a thing about Caleb in your yard. He said, I don't know why I said that. I've thought about it every day since. She said, don't tell me. Tell him. She said, he'll hear it. He nodded. He did not weep. He was not that kind of man. But he sat for a long time with his hand on his son's head, and Sarah understood that a thing had been laid down. The other cliffhanger, the one Sarah had carried for 8 weeks, was answered the next morning. Ash came in from the barn with a small oilcloth packet in his hand. He said, Mom, he said, I found this in the tack box in the barn. It was behind the cinch strap. He said, I do not think anyone has moved that cinch strap since your husband stopped riding. Sarah took the packet. She unwrapped it at the kitchen table. Inside was a folded page, in Caleb's careful pencil, in the same climbing hand. It was the missing page. It began without an inner sheathing of studs and boards, packed floor to ceiling, with dry chaff and hardwood ash in equal measure, hand-packed, no settling permitted. It went on for a paragraph more. It described the trench, and the stone, and the tilt, and the packing between the stones, which was river sand mixed with charcoal, a thing they had not done, and which Ash said, reading it, would have made the trench some measure better, but had not been necessary to make it work. At the bottom of the page, in a hand that was shakier than the rest, was one more line. It said, "If you are reading this and I am gone, I am sorry I did not finish. I meant to. Do the best you can. It will be enough." Sarah read it twice. She folded the page. She put it in the tin box with the other one. She did not show it to Ash, and she did not show it to the guests in her house, and she did not show it to Harlan Peake when he came back on the 4th day with more supplies. She only put it away. She went outside. She stood behind the north wall of the house, and she looked at the trench, buried now under 4 feet of snow, and she put her hand flat against the wall, and the wall was warm. The winter went on. The winter always went on. The storm of December was followed by a milder January, and then a killing February, and the Tollers and the old couple stayed with Sarah until the 3rd week of February, when the roads opened enough for them to be moved back to Kettle Bend. Elmer Toller shook Ash's hand before he left. He did not shake Sarah's hand. He took her hand in both of his, and he held it, and he said, "Mom." He did not say anything else. He did not need to. Ash stayed. He mended the fences in March, as the ground thawed and the posts could be reset. He mended every fence on the 300 acres. He worked from the north line down to the south, and he did not skip a rod, and he did not cut a corner. And when he was done in the last week of April, Sarah walked the fence line with him, and she looked at his work, and she said, "You did what you said you would do." He said, "Yes, Mom." She said, "Will you stay through summer?" He said, "Yes, Mom." She said, "Will you stay through the fall?" He said, "Yes, Mom." She did not ask about the winter. She did not need to. He never left her ranch again. He built a small cabin of his own on the west side of the creek, 100 yards from the main house, and he lived there alone, and he came to the main house for breakfast and for supper, and he worked the ranch with her for the rest of his life. He was buried, when his time came, in the corner of the yard nearest the north wall, at Sarah's instruction, so that in winter the last of the sun would fall on his grave the way it fell on the stones her husband had taught her to lay. She lived to be 81 years old. She never married again. She was not lonely. She had a ranch and a wall that held heat and a hand who kept his word. And she had 2 folded pages in a tin box in the top drawer of the sideboard, and she read them, from time to time, on the nights when the wind came down out of the north, the way it had come the December Caleb died. And she was reminded, every time, of what she had learned in that winter and the years after. She had learned that a man could leave a woman an instruction he did not have time to finish, and that the finishing was hers, and that the finishing would be imperfect, and that the imperfection was not a failing, but a form of honor. She had learned that a stone could be taught to hold the sun. She had learned that ash and chaff, which every farmer in the county threw away, could stand between a family and the cold. She had learned that a drifter who said "stay till spring" and meant it was a rarer thing than any deed or dowry. She had learned that grief, worked into the ground with a shovel, would come back up in the spring as something a person could stand on. She kept the tin box until she died. She left it to no one in particular. It was found after her funeral by a great-nephew from Nebraska who did not know what the pages meant, and he took them home, and they were lost in a house fire 11 years later. And by then, it did not matter, because the wall Sarah Wren had built was still standing, and the trench her husband had begun was still catching the low winter sun, and every north wall built in that valley for the next 40 years was built with an inner sheathing packed with dry chaff and ash. And no one remembered anymore where the practice had started. A father cannot give his son every answer. The best ones leave behind enough questions to build a life on. If this story stayed with you, the next one is already waiting by the fire.